Today, we're tackling a critical challenge: how to communicate the real-world impact of your work. I'm going to show you why defining the problem your research solves is the key to making people care, whether you're pitching to investors, talking to policymakers, or just explaining what you do to friends. We'll explore the jobs to be done framework and share a simple tool to reframe your research in 3 different ways, depending on your audience. Let's dive in.
Thanks again to Campus Plus for inviting me here today to talk with all of you. What we're going to be covering today is what problem does my research solve? And this is a really interesting question because it's a question about communication. It's a question about why defining your problem actually enables you to be more effective at communicating why your research is so valuable by talking about the real world impacts that you're able to make. I'll be talking a little bit today about why this is so hard. And I'll also be going into the concept of absorptive capacity. So, about what happens when the person that you are talking to does not have the capacity to inhale the technical details and nuances that you are able to provide to them. Also, today I want to introduce you to the jobs to be done approach, which is an approach that's used in business and innovation to try and identify what is interesting and unique about an innovation. And then I'm going to end out by providing you with what I hope is a pretty simple and elegant tool that will enable you to reframe your research. It's almost a positioning tool to help you present and communicate your research in 3 different ways, depending upon the audience that you're talking to. So hang in there. What I wanted to do first, though, is I wanted to take you back to October 2001. So this is the day that Apple launched a brand new product called the iPod. If you were there, I was there. I just want you to imagine for a moment that you were maybe in the audience for that product launch, waiting to hear what the product is all about. On that day, had decided to launch the iPod by focusing on its technical details. So what we know about the iPod was that it was an MP3 player. It had a 5 gig hard drive, a 10-hour battery life, and it weighed 6.5 ounces. So that's all true. That's all factually correct. And those are the technical specifications of the iPod. But it doesn't tell you why you should care. It doesn't tell you what matters about this product. And if you weren't interested in technical specifications, there's no way you would be excited just by learning about those features. How would you even know why this was a game changer? So that's exactly what happens when we focus on the features of something, the technical aspects of it, rather than the problem that it solves. So just contrast this with what Steve Jobs actually said when he introduced the iPod for the first time.
Boom. That's iPod. I have a shovel right here in my pocket. There it is, right there. Amazing little device holds 1,000 songs. It goes right in my pocket. And this is what the front looks like.
And so in just 10 words, what Steve Jobs did there was he completely reframed what the iPod was. He didn't say it's a 5 gig MP3 player. He said it's 1,000 songs and it fits in your pocket. I mean, really simple, such a simple statement. But that was what really connected with people. And it answered that question that we all need to be asking ourselves, which is, why does this matter? And the reason that Steve Jobs described the iPod as so powerful is because people don't buy features. They buy solutions. They buy benefits. And so this is just as true for communicating your research as it is for selling a product. If you're focusing on the technical details of your work, which are basically the features of what you do, you are at risk of losing your audience if you are not talking to somebody who is already in the same sphere as you. But if you frame your research in terms of the problem that it's solving and the impact that it has, people will understand it, but they'll also care about it as well. I think this is really an exercise in empathy, because what you're trying to establish here is that shift from the content of what you are producing to the connection with somebody. And that's really about inviting them into a conversation and meeting them where they're at rather than where you're at. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be positioning your research so that people will instantly see why it matters to them. So my first question for you is, are you a solution looking for a problem, or can you clearly define the problem that your research solves? Now, the reality is that impact doesn't happen automatically. It depends on how well you can articulate your research and package it up for people. You really need to be able to connect those dots for people, because what is obvious to you, because you have this vast wealth of knowledge about your technology or your innovation or about your research, may not be obvious to somebody who's coming in cold. So some of the things you want to think about are, how does your research change how things are done? How does it solve a real world problem in a way that it can be applied by maybe industry or in society? And if you're unclear about answering these questions, this is where repackaging your work can make a really big difference. So this is a really key concept that I'd really like you to take on board, because a key factor in how your research is able to be absorbed and assessed is how you package or frame your research up. It's about enabling your audience to understand you. And what that means is you need to make the effort to speak their language, even if it means changing how you are packaging your research. Now, what I'm showing you here is KFC as it appears in Quebec in Canada. So we all know KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, by its initials KFC, but because Quebec is in a French-speaking region of Canada and it has strict naming laws, they were required to effectively rebrand. And KFC is actually translated into Poulet Frit Kentucky, which means that the acronym that reflects that is PFK. So for KFC to be accepted into that market, it needed to repackage what it was. It was still exactly the same company under the hood, but it actually literally needed to speak a different language in order to succeed and to be accepted. So if you can repackage your research in a way that highlights its real world relevance, you can make a really strong case for funding or partnerships or just broader implementation. But here's the problem. Apparently researchers are really, really bad at this. So, I mean, if you spend any time at all reading about science in the media, and this literally took me all of 30 seconds to pull up these 3 articles arguing that there's a massive communication problem in science. You've probably seen headlines like this yourself. The message is pretty clear. Scientists and researchers and academics have a massive communication problem. And it's not just journalists who are saying this. I hear it from investors, I hear it from politicians, and I hear it from industry partners. They all speak to this problem of how difficult it is to understand what researchers and academics are actually working on and why their work is important. This perception that the academics and researchers are poor communicators is really critical, because it can have some big consequences when it comes to getting funding or influencing policy or getting your guidelines taken up in the real world, or even just getting people to trust your expertise. But arguably, that's not the real picture. I personally don't believe that scientists and researchers are really bad at communicating. I think there's something else that's going on here, because I see an awful lot of highly effective and highly nuanced communication happening in academic conferences. I see beautiful communication happening in journals. I see magnificent sort of interdisciplinary communication happening in the lunchrooms over coffees. Scientists and researchers and academics are not bad communicators. They are superb communicators, because we communicate constantly with detail and precision and clarity and nuance and accuracy. Within our own circles, within our own groups, we are excellent at communicating with each other. The problem comes when we communicate with a different audience entirely, somebody who's coming in completely cold. I mean, of course, we're going to be at ease when we are speaking with people who match our level of knowledge and who are able to grasp the foundations of our work instantly without us needing to sort of backfill. But we have to recognize that when we are talking with somebody who doesn't have that foundation, somebody like a policymaker who's coming in a bit cold, or somebody like an investor who isn't an expert in your industry, We need to understand how to meet them where they are at so that we can ensure that our work is communicated in a way that they can understand. And what that requires is for us to take a little bit of a step backwards and to translate our research and our work into a form that's going to resonate with that particular audience. And that's what we're going to be exploring next, because it's not that academics and researchers and scientists cannot communicate. It's just that it's difficult to communicate to a non-expert audience. We often make the mistake of communicating as if we're communicating with our peers. When you're communicating on an expert level without even knowing it, you tend to use a whole bunch of jargon and a whole bunch of acronyms that you no longer see as jargon or acronyms because everybody in your sector uses them, but they are still a barrier to communication in a really strong way. And this is where communication can break down. It's not because you're not being clear, it's because your audience just doesn't have the absorptive capacity to process the information in the same way that your colleagues or peers would. So let's talk for a minute about absorptive capacity. This is really how much can your audience take in when we're talking about it in the sense of business or organizational studies. This is the ability of a company, for example, to be able to recognize the value of new information, to be able to assimilate it, and then to be able to apply it commercially. The same applies when you're dealing with actual real life humans. Everybody has a limit to how much they can absorb at any one time. And if people are already tapped out, it's like you're trying to pour water into the top of a glass that's already full. It's really easy to tap people out when we start by leading with technical details or features or jargon. The water just spills over the side and hardly any of it gets in, and nobody actually gets the value of the water to drink. Doesn't mean that we need to dumb down our research at all. It just means, as I said earlier, it's a question of packaging it in a slightly different way. And what I mean by that is you instinctively know that you package an idea differently when you're speaking to a 7-year-old and then a 17-year-old and then a 70-year-old. And this is really what I'm talking about here. It's about tailoring your messaging to the audience that's receiving it so that you don't start with a sort of PhD level technical description of quantum mechanics when you're dealing with a presentation to a primary school, for example. If we lead with the wrong level of detail, if we're too technical, if we're too abstract, our audience is going to tune us out. And that means that it's really difficult for the value of our research to come through. So we need to figure out ways to structure our communication so that each layer of information builds upon the next, and so that you can reach those technical heights eventually, but often we don't lead with them. So this is really important. Meet your audience where they're at, not where you currently are. And then once they're hooked in and engaged, then you can start to build on it with more and more detail. So how do we meet people where they're at? Well, one of the most important shifts you can make when you're communicating your research to non-experts is to reframe it from being a process-driven description to a problem-solving statement. And most of us will naturally default to a process-driven description because it's technically correct. Like, it's the method that we are using, it's the mechanism of action, it's our technical focus. But then when we're speaking to somebody who's coming in cold, this kind of misses the bigger picture, which is what's important to them and why should they care. If I'm communicating with someone and I say that my research focuses on enzymatic pathways and bacterial biofilms, technically correct, but the majority of people who are non-experts wouldn't understand why that's important. Whereas if you kind of frame it in a problem-solving statement about, I'm working on a new way to stop bacterial infections that don't respond to antibiotics, now we've gone from describing what we do to describing what the real world problem is that we're solving. And suddenly the impact of that research becomes really, really clear. And this is a small shift, but it's pretty powerful, because when you're talking with someone who is potentially investing into your research, whether that's a public agency or it's a venture capital investor or it's an industry stakeholder, they legitimately do not care about the mechanism. They're not investing in the mechanism. They're investing in the solution to a defined problem. So if you can define the problem that you're solving, you make it so much easier for other people to actually see and realize the value in your work that you kind of know intuitively. So some of the questions that you can ask yourself as you go through this process, when you're describing your research to people who are not industry experts, are you leading with your process description, or are you leading with the problem that you're solving? Now that we've talked about shifting from process to problem, I just want to take it one step further and talk to you about this framework, which is the jobs to be done framework, which is actually a really useful way of defining the real world impact of your research. So this is a concept that comes from business and innovation, but it applies perfectly in the research environment. And the idea is really simple. People don't buy products, they hire them to do a specific job. And what that means is that people aren't buying a drill, something that drills hole. They actually really want a hole in the wall. So the job that needs to be done here is a tool or a mechanism or a method that provides me with a hole in the wall. And so the same sort of thinking applies in research as it does in this business framework, which is if we only describe our work in technical terms, we're describing a drill. And we miss the opportunity to explain the job that it actually performs in the real world, which is providing holes in walls. So, for example, a standard research description might be to say, we're developing AI for medical imaging. And absolutely, that tells you what you're doing, but it doesn't tell you why it matters. So if you take the jobs to be done approach and you try and identify what people would hire AI for medical imaging to do, you come up with a slightly different framing. So the job that needs to be done here could arguably be helping doctors to detect cancer earlier and more accurately. And so when you reframe your research on the job that it is doing, the impact becomes really much more clear. You're now solving a problem that people care about. So when you're thinking about your research, you might want to just ask, okay, so what is the job that this research is doing? Who's going to be benefiting from it? And what problem would remain unsolved if my research didn't make it out into the real world? So if you can answer those kinds of questions, you're in a much, much stronger position to be able to communicate the value of your work. And that means you're much more likely to be able to get buy-in and support for your work so that it can resonate outside your organization. I'll just do another one, this time looking in the social sciences field. So using the jobs to be done lens. Imagine you're a researcher and you're studying the effects of remote work on employee productivity. You might simply state, we're examining the effects of remote work on employee productivity. Technically correct, but it doesn't immediately show why people should care about the research that you're doing. So what's the actual job that your research is there to do? What is the problem that it is solving? Well, one job that it might be doing is helping companies to design remote work policies to keep employees engaged and productive. Now, with this version, the job that the research is performing and the problem that it is solving and the value that it is adding becomes much more clear. It's not just studying something, it's solving a real problem that businesses and employees face. This is pretty powerful because it will immediately tell somebody who's not an expert in your field why they should care and why this is really important. They don't have to make the connection themselves. This is stuff that you know intuitively. This is the whole reason that you're doing your research. You know the impact that this is going to have. You know why you decided to do the study in the first place. You could see the problem and the curiosity led you to do the research, but you need to be able to articulate that in a way that people can absorb. So it doesn't really matter whether you're in the hard sciences or engineering or health or social sciences. The key question is the same. What problem is your research being hired to solve and who benefits from it? Because if you can answer those two things, then you're able to build a much more compelling case for people to support your research, either through ongoing funding or through research commercialization or partnerships with industry. So we've already talked about how the jobs to be done framework kind of helps to reframe research around the problems that it solves, but it's also a critical tool for making a case that your research is the best solution to a problem. Because if you can clearly define the job that your research is doing or the problem that it is solving, and then you can analyze how that problem is currently being solved by other mechanisms, that puts you in a much stronger position to be able to make a case that your research is either going to create better outcomes, or it's going to be a more effective solution, or it's going to be more innovative than what's already out there in the world. And without that additional level of clarity, it can be quite difficult for investors or policymakers or funders or industry partners to get on board, because they can't see why your approach is necessary, and they might not understand how it improves on what's already out there. And that means that there's a risk that you might get overlooked. So the next step in today's webinar is to look at how your research fits into the bigger picture. So what is the current state of solving this problem, and how does your work change or improve that? So going back to the drill example, what is this? It's a drill. What does it do? It drills holes. What is the job that I need done? I need a hole in the wall. Once you define the problem that your research addresses, the next step is trying to figure out what else is out there that already does that job, if it's even being solved at all. There are lots of solutions. So you might use a drill to make a hole in the wall. You might use a hammer and a nail. You might go onto YouTube and find that there's a whole selection of videos that tell you how to make a hole in a wall without a drill. So there's a range of different ways that that job can get done. Your technology or your solution is only one of many. In most cases, it's one of many ways to solve a different problem. But each of these solutions will have different vectors associated with it. They may come with some trade-offs. It might be expensive to buy a drill. It might be quite cheap to use a hammer and a nail, but it might be less effective. It might be less efficient. It might be more labor intensive. So once you're able to identify how that problem is being solved out in the real world, it gives you an opportunity to understand what it is about your work or your research that is different to what's already out there, and why your research is valuable compared to the current state. So let's take this into a research setting. And I'll run an example with you about how this might work using kind of a real world example. This is a technology that I came into contact with when I was doing some work with the University of Canterbury. So this is digital image elastotomography, and it's a novel technology that is being used to identify when there is stiffness in breast tissue. So the first question is, what does it do? Well, it can identify stiffness in breast tissue. So what else is doing that job at the moment? How else can I get that job done? And there are a range of different methods that people can use for breast screening. So if this is a technology that can help people screen for signs of breast cancer, what else is out there? There's a breast exam, there's mammography, there's breast MRIs. There are a range of different technologies that can be used to detect or screen for breast cancer in the early stages, but each of them have different price points, each of them have different sensitivity levels. And so this now provides you with a bit of a framework to be able to identify what it is about your technology that is either better or different or more effective than the technologies that are already in the market. Take the example of a hydrogel technology that can remove nitrates from drinking water. So what is the job that this hydrogel is doing? Well, when people are using something like this hydrogel, what they really want, the job that they're really hiring it to do, is to keep nitrates in drinking water at healthy levels. And then when you look in the market about how people are actually giving effect to that, there are a range of different mechanisms in terms of using resin beads, ion exchange, reverse osmosis, and interestingly, just plain dilution. So pouring clean water into nitrate contaminated water to dilute the contamination down to acceptable levels. As with the previous example, each of those different jobs is being done by those different technologies at different price points. Now we know where ours is different, and we have the opportunity to make the argument as to why ours is better. Being able to combine those three constituent parts together provides us with a really powerful way of expressing what that real world impact is of our technology and why somebody would want to support it, why it fills a gap, or why it advances the field, or why it's just a better alternative. Because when you know that your technology is competing against these other different options, it gives you the opportunity to ask yourself why yours is the best solution. Is it more effective? Is it more cost effective? Is it more accessible? Is it faster or more scalable? Is it more sustainable? People don't want to know that a problem exists. They want to know why your research is the right answer for them. So it means clearly articulating why your work is in some way, shape, or form better than what is out there at the moment. Because from experience, let's take pitching for investment, for example, and I've been in a lot of those situations, my experience is that the strongest pitches or proposals aren't just describing what the technology does, they make it impossible to ignore why this is important, why this is necessary, and why it is better than anything else that is out there at the moment. So if you can do that, you are already streets ahead of most other people when it comes to communicating the value of what you do. So I guess in many respects, that's all very well and good when we are communicating in the written form. But I want to talk to you now about how you actually verbally talk about your research, because what happens when you are ambushed by a stranger and they want to know what it is that you do and why it's important. I think every single researcher or academic that I've ever worked with has at some point struggled to explain what they do in a way that actually lands with a non-expert audience. Because the reason for that is pretty clear. You're spending years working in a really deeply complex and technical field, and it's hard to take that step back and pull it apart and understand what it is that somebody else would want to know about it. And so when somebody asks you, so what do you do? In that moment, it's quite hard to come up with a simple answer. But also in my experience, this kind of thing doesn't happen just in casual conversations. This is the sort of thing that you're likely to bounce into at networking events or at conferences or in professional settings, when you're talking to journalists, when you're talking to politicians, or if you bump into a potential collaborator or industry partner at a function. It's really important to be able to talk about your research and adjust the way that you describe your work in a way that meets the person that you are talking to where they are at, matches their level of interest and understanding, and enables them to absorb what you do in a way that you can then build towards your complexity. So having a structured way to position your research, I think, without overcomplicating it, is pretty important. So what I want to start with next is to look at one of the toughest communication challenges that you might face, and which is explaining your work in an everyday situation, like at a barbecue. So imagine you're at a barbecue, happens all the time, and a stranger turns to you and asks you, so what do you do? And you take that second to think it through. And your instant answer is often, oh, I'm a researcher in social sciences, or, oh, I'm a physicist. But that's so vague that people still don't get a sense of, I guess, the importance of the work that you're doing. And it may be difficult to connect with somebody or spark interest with them. Sometimes even the description of your field is going to be beyond the absorptive capacity of some people. And you might even lose them before you've finished your first sentence. So what do you say? I mean, this is a real test of how you can communicate your research to somebody who is not an expert in the field. But here's the thing. If you can communicate your work at a barbecue in a way that is clear and compelling and engaging and makes a person actually care about what you're doing, then you can probably do it just about anywhere. And this isn't just, as I said, it's not just about casual conversations. It's a challenge that you're going to face in any professional setting. So it's a challenge you'll face when you're talking to industry stakeholders, politicians, or even leaders within your organization who don't have the technical background that you have, to be able to influence your ideas throughout your own organization. This is a challenge that you need to overcome. You need to be able to understand how to adapt your message to different audiences so that you can get their buy-in to what you're doing. So what I wanted to introduce you to today is what I call the problem statement matrix, which is a really simple but structured way to help you to have a ready explanation for almost any level of audience participation. Now, don't be put off. I will walk you through all of this. But essentially, this is a problem statement matrix, and it's a piece of work that I've created by adapting Matt Church's work on thought leadership. Matt Church runs a thought leadership program based in Australia. He has created a positioning matrix for thought leaders that enables people to take their complex thinking and articulate it in a way that resonates with a range of different audiences in a range of different scenarios. I've found it really useful personally. What I've done is I've adapted that for a research setting because I think it would also be really useful for you to be able to come up with, to understand some of the hacks that they use. The real beauty of this matrix is the concept that you can instantly adjust your message to match kind of the energy level and the interest of the person that you're communicating with. And the problem that often happens is when we're talking about something that's really important and exciting to us, we start off with high energy. Like we talk about the massive challenges that the world is facing and this huge breakthrough that you're a part of and the transformation that's going to happen in the world. If we don't meet people where they're at, we risk losing their attention. So people will engage with you at different energy levels, and that will depend on a lot of different factors. It could depend upon their expertise, their background, their interest levels, how well you know them, how much beer's been going down at the barbecue. There's a whole range of different things that will impact how people present to you. Some people want a high level takeaway. Other people care about the details. Others might be engaged, but they just need you to articulate what the real problem is. Some people want you to start with the technical specifics. I guess core to this is knowing that matching someone's energy level isn't about dumbing down your research. Not at all. It's about creating a bridge between your extensive knowledge and somebody who is coming in cold and being able to walk them through the value that your research is likely to provide to your community or to the world or to industry. The better that we get at being able to create those bridges, the more effectively we can create connections and create opportunities for partnership or funding or collaboration. And that's how we get to make a real world impact. So in short, if somebody is casually interested, start with low energy. Once you get somebody interested, you might shift into medium. And if they're really engaged, you might want to click into a high energy response. So I'll take you through each of those different stages so that you can see what I'm talking about. But effectively, what it means is that instead of struggling to reach for words and figure out how you can articulate what it is that you do in a way that makes sense, you'll be able to walk into situations with this pre-formed cheat sheet, effectively, of how to raise or lower the technical detail of what you're talking about based upon the feedback that you get in real time. So let's break it down. Low energy is where you want to start. So if you're walking into like a casual conversation or somebody that you don't know and somebody's coming in cold, you might want to start with answering what area of science you're in. So what's your category? What are you investigating, which is your question, and then where could this be used? So this is the simplest, potentially most beige, most boring, like you've got to be grey rock boring at this level. This is literally just opening a door and sending out a probe to see if anybody has even the slightest interest in the work that you're doing. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm working on a medical imaging tool that can identify tumors in the human body. And we're not talking about digital image elastotomography here. We're not talking about breast cancer at all. We're being as beige as possible just so that people get a bit of a taster as to what it is that you're doing. And this is often the place to start if you're in a networking event or if you're at a casual party. Conferences are probably medium level. It's where you're in a situation where you might be asked the same question again and again. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? If somebody shows a little bit of interest in what you do and goes, oh, I think that's really interesting. What do you mean by that? That is your permission to flip into the next level of energy and to take it up a notch and to add a little bit more depth, which is where you get the opportunity, because they've invited you in, right? They've invited you into this conversation. You get to explain the problem there and how your research is solving a real world problem and why that matters. So in this level, you want to start talking about the status quo. And notice all of this is linking back into the jobs to be done. It's all coming together. You talk about what we already know and what's accepted knowledge. Then you get to throw a little bit more meat onto the bones of what your research does and start talking a bit more about the technical aspects of what you do. But most importantly, I think, is this right-hand column where you're talking about the impact that you make and what problem this is helping to solve. So you can flow through that as well. Somebody's saying, oh, yeah, I'm a mechanical engineer and I'm working on medical imaging, helping to detect tumors in the human body. Someone goes, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. So how does that work? Well, actually, when we often think about mammograms, they're the current gold standard, but they're painful and they don't detect tumors in dense breast tissue. So we're using digital image-based elastotomography to sort of using high-speed cameras and mapping tissue stiffness without radiation or discomfort. And because of this, we're hoping to improve detection in dense breast tissue and increase screening accessibility. So this is the second sort of level of flow that you might want to go through if somebody's showing some interest in your work. It's adding more meat to the bones and building that staircase up of absorptive capacity. And someone's going, wow, that's amazing. What made you get into this? That's your permission to go full noise, high energy, right? And this is possibly the space that a lot of us really like to inhabit, because this is where you're really passionate about your work. This is where you get the opportunity to express why this is important to you personally and why you've chosen to come into this field and why this breakthrough matters and what you're hoping to achieve. Because every researcher that I've ever met, when they enter into a research project, they're actually trying to solve a problem. I mean, there's curiosity for sure, but it's curiosity with a cause. This is where you can kind of capture somebody's attention, because this is now where you're storytelling, right? You talk about what is changing in the field and why your research is so unique and what are the key discovery elements of it. And then moving into the transformation, like this is the highest impact, highest energy space you can be. How are we transforming lives or industry? What's the transformative potential? If you're doing a pitch for investment funding, this is a line that you're probably going to live in if you're trying to do a high impact presentation with a journalist. This is the line that you're going to live in when you're trying to convince somebody of the importance of your work, right? It's not where you start necessarily. This is not the entry point for a lot of people. But in certain circumstances, this is the best place to go, right? This is where you go if you need to convince someone that what you're doing is urgent and impactful. So you can see the difference in presentation here. Now we're talking about how breast cancer is the most common cancer globally, but it's really uncomfortable and it's expensive to detect it early. And actually, those detection methods are really ineffective for younger women who have denser breasts. But the breakthrough of this technology is we're able to detect those tumors really early, even on dense breast tissue, by using a mechanical method that's non-invasive. And this can absolutely revolutionize breast cancer screening because it's safer, it's pain-free, and it's more accessible, especially for women in underserved regions, right? So the cadence has completely changed. The passion has completely changed. We've gone from I'm a mechanical engineer to I'm actually revolutionizing and changing the world. And that's the journey that you can go through depending upon how engaged somebody is with your research. I guess the key here is fluidity, the concept that you don't get locked down into a single row. It's the concept that you can go up or down depending on someone's interest or engagement. And if they start with a low energy question, for example, and then they show some curiosity, you might want to click it up a level and go a little harder on your energy. And if they show more curiosity, then go even higher. But if you go in with high energy, you may find that you lose them. So step down a road, try out a different method and see if you're able to bring them back and get them engaged. The whole purpose of this kind of positioning / problem definition matrix is to enable you to connect with somebody, anybody, anywhere, and in any position by presenting a few different ways that you can present or package up your research. If you complete one of these matrices, this is kind of what you're going to end up with, where you've got 3 different levels of communication that you can bounce between depending upon how people are responding to you. This is something that you can and should prepare in advance before you go into a networking situation or before you go into a stakeholder meeting, because you may have a multitude of different types of absorptive capacities sitting around that stakeholder table. You might have somebody who's a complete newbie who hasn't had any background briefing on why you're there, and the low energy is the first thing that they want to hear. But equally, you might have a researcher who's sitting in there who has the background on what you're doing and wants to know a little bit more on that medium energy level about the technical details of what it is that you're doing and how it can be applied. But then you might have someone also sitting around the table who wants to understand the big picture and who gets inspired by the storytelling. And that's where your high energy response can come out. And what you'll find is you might use all 3 of them in one conversation or in one meeting as you start to build the absorptive capacity throughout your storytelling. This isn't just for hard sciences, for example. This is another real world example that I've pulled off the internet. Yes, I did used to work at ag research, but I never worked on this particular framework. This is a social sciences framework, which is the ag research resilience framework. And this kind of is a way to show you how this matrix can apply to research beyond the hard sciences. So if we're starting with the low energy, this is how it would express in this example. I'm a social scientist. I'm investigating how rural communities adapt to change so that I can help them remain sustainable and resilient. Again, very beige. That's very barbecue. This is anyone can kind of access that. There's not a lot of jargon there. And somebody comes and goes, oh, that's really interesting. So what do you mean? Like, why is that important? Then you click into medium energy. You talk about the pressures that communities are under, what you're examining in your research in terms of economic diversification and sustainable land use, and then why that's important, right? Because by identifying the most effective strategies, we can provide policymakers and leaders with tools to support thriving rural communities. That's your invitation to click it up another level, to go into your high energy. And that is where you talk about rural communities being the backbone of food production, but they're under so much pressure. And if they collapse, everything else goes sideways. And then you get to flick back into the output of your research here. So what specifically are you doing? We've developed a resilience framework that helps communities assess their strengths. And the massive impact that you're having, the high energy, high impact story, is that supporting rural resilience isn't just about protecting these small communities. It's about food security, making sure our food supplies are safe, making sure we've got economic stability. Like, this is the really big picture stuff. This is the transformation that you're hoping to achieve from your work. So bringing it all together. So here's how you recap. This matrix, in my mind at least, will give you 3 key advantages. The first one is it will make your communication adaptable, right? You can shift your message up and down based upon your interest level, the expertise and the energy of your audience. The second advantage that this kind of framing or packaging can give you is it'll help you to communicate with clarity and confidence instead of having to reach for the words in your head to describe what it is that you do in a way that people can understand. You'd have done the work before you walked into that situation, and you've got some ready words ready to go, which will enable you to speak with confidence and clarity. And that's always much more compelling than having someone in front of you struggle to articulate what it is that they do. The third important thing that this will give you is it can make sure that your research is communicated and connects to real world relevance. It kind of moves you beyond the technical explanations and into the storytelling element that will help you to build that connection rather than just the content. So I guess the key questions here is, how would I explain my research in a low energy factual way? How do I add depth and clarity when somebody shows some interest? And then how do I make my work urgent, compelling, and action driven? And if you can nail those things, you've got a really powerful tool to be able to describe what problem your research is solving. And this isn't about memorizing a script in any way, shape, or form. This is not about that. It's about developing the flexibility to be able to shift your message in real time, recognizing where your audience is at. So just to wrap that up, I've got 3 key takeaways as we get to the close out of this webinar. For me, possibly the first and most important lesson is that people care about problems. They don't care about processes. So when you are putting a research proposal in, or you're pitching to an investor, or you're talking with industry stakeholders, the first thing that they care about isn't how you do something, it's about why it matters to them. So if you can clearly define the problem that your research solves, it will be much, much easier to convince other people of its value. If you remember the iPod example, Apple didn't lead with specifications, they led with benefits. And the same applies to research communication. If you define the problem that your work is addressing, you'll be able to make a much more compelling argument for people to care and come on board. The second takeaway for me is one of the most practical shifts that you can make is to move away from talking about the process to the problem to the impact. So instead of starting with what you do, try and reframe your research by focusing on the problem that it addresses. Try and use the job to be done framework to clarify who it benefits and how it makes a difference. Because having a really well-framed research problem will make your work easier to fund, easier to explain, and more impactful. And that third takeaway is that effective communication is not about oversimplifying. You're not dumbing yourself down. You're just meeting people where they're at, and you are structuring information in the right way to enable them to absorb it. This is not about removing complexity. It's about presenting the right information at the right time. And this goes way back to the CAT and absorptive capacity. People can only absorb so much at once. So if you overload them with technical details, they might shut up and disengage, and that's not what you want. You want people to be curious, to be asking you questions, and to give you permission to move into the technical details. Please don't be too hard on yourself if you're finding that this is a lot for you to absorb or that this is hard for you. Defining the problem that we're solving, communicating impact, leading with benefits instead of features, and all of these things, these are skills. And these are learned skills. And like any skill, it takes time to develop. And what we know about Steve Jobs is he was actually a pretty awful communicator back in the 70s when he started out. And it took him years and years and years of study on marketing techniques and communication for him to be able to stand up in 2001 and do that very, very short pitch. That wasn't something that happened overnight for him. He put a huge amount of time and effort into it. I think Wozniak actually said that the reason that Steve Jobs became so good at communicating was that he wasn't a particularly skilled computer engineer. So he focused really hard on the business skills and the communication skills. So again, don't be too hard on yourself if you're struggling to communicate the impact of your research. That's okay. You're in very, very good company. The key, at least from my perspective, is to keep at it, to keep using these tools, to keep refining and reflecting and practicing and thinking about how to connect your work to the people who need to hear it most. Because if you can do that, we stand a much better chance of solving some of those wicked problems that we have in the world today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brooke. That was an excellent session. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I just want to flip into a couple of questions there. We've got a question from Linda Pham in the chat. When you look at the high energy of the model that you presented, how do you recommend explaining at high energy levels without giving away any detail around the IP itself or the research, the underlying basis of what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's very difficult to answer in a very general sense. It's the same answer that you would have with any communication. The actual novelty of what you're doing on a technical level is often something that you wouldn't be sharing at that high energy level. You might be sharing the concept or the general method that you're using rather than the specific attributes of what it is or the specific concentrations. It's hard for me to articulate how to do that, but that's something that you'd be able to get advice from your tech transfer office on. You can talk with them about what it is that you're wanting to communicate, and they will be able to let you know where the novelty from a patent perspective is likely to sit and how you can communicate in a way that avoids talking about that novelty.
And your final thoughts here about be too hard on yourself. There's obviously a degree of practice that should be involved in terms of you're not going to be able to get this right out of the box and you're going to need to fine tune it. What are some of the ways you think that people could practice or just, in their own time or in their own way, begin to develop their skill in applying this sort of thinking and practicing the application of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I always treat friends and family as guinea pigs, right? Because they're your softest audience, and they will be the ones who will be able to tell you what that low level comes across like first. So start with your low level pitch until you're able to say that, and that will roll off your tongue really, really quickly. There will be multiple opportunities to practice this. Whenever you come across somebody in a networking situation, that's when you crank out your matrix that you've pre-prepared and then gauge the reaction that you get. There's no right way to prepare the answers for one of these matrices. The problem that you're solving can change over time as you learn more about your technology, right? You might find that actually this has got a much broader application than I originally thought. Equally, you may find that as your technology evolves, the initial problem that you wanted to solve is no longer viable. So you might have pivoted into something else. So this is not a static document. This is something that evolves over time. You kind of refine it as you get feedback from real people. My encouragement would be to just get out there and give it a crack, because you don't get better at something just by thinking about it. You get better by doing it and doing it again and again and again.
The other observation I made is that the problem statement matrix, in terms of going through that exercise, although we're pitching it here and positioning it in terms of the conversational element, in terms of communicating directly, voice, that one-to-one communication with people, there's also an approach there that can actually also benefit your written communications as a result as well, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The purpose of that matrix is literally to give you the opportunity to express the impact of your research in 3 completely different ways. But the thought processes that underpin that will enable you to articulate your research in written form as well. It does give you those 3 different levels. And what you might find in a research proposal is that you would use all 3 of those levels as you go through your research proposal. There'll be a technical section where you get into the technical details of the problem you're solving. There'll be an introduction system where you talk about who you are as a researcher. And then there's going to be the big picture transformational section that people want to know about.
No worries. Look, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you took a lot out of that today. I certainly did. Thank you, and thanks everyone for attending today. Much appreciated.